Hello and welcome to Everyone's a Storyteller. I'm Dr. Dainty Jones and I serve as Director of Fund Development at the Ensemble Theater of Houston, Texas. And I am so honored today to have a special guest, and I'm going to ask him now to introduce himself.
Right. So my name is Cale Carter. I am the director of exhibitions here at the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum.
Wonderful. And will you tell us a little more about what your position entails, Mr. Carter?
So my primary position is to help in the creation as well as maintaining of exhibitions here at the museum. And that would include everything from conducting the historical research, making sure the information that we put out is historically accurate, as well as coming up with ideas for exhibitions, finding ways to connect the historic subject matter that we cover to other subject matter. So like normally when we talk about Black military history, we tend to think of Black military history only being connected to military and political, but there's also connections to cultural and other aspects of life as well. So part of my job, in addition to doing exhibition creation, stuff like that, is to do historical research and when creating exhibitions, find ways to connect the historical subject matter to things that people can relate to today. Well, that's the best way I can summarize it in a short time without going to a lengthy tangent. So,
Yes. Oh, that sounds so interesting. And I'm hoping some of our students who will be viewing this video will be just as interested. So thank you so much for explaining what you do. So next, what kind of storytelling is helpful in your position? Whether it's inspirational or motivational, what kind of storytelling do you tend to use?
well, most storytelling that we tend to use when we do our historic research, pretty much just the sheer experience that a person go through. It doesn't have to, like, basically genuine experience, meaning that in some cases, some of the stories that we come across are inspirational, but some of the stories we come across are sometimes they can be dark in some cases. So it's kind of a mixture of uplifting, but also sometimes harsh truths. And when we when we basically have those stories incorporated in our exhibitions, part of the reason why we tend to go for, I would say, kind of genuine story that incorporate both of those elements is because in reality, when we talk about military life, particularly for Black soldiers, on the one hand, it is easy for us to focus on the positive aspects, but you and I both know that when we live this thing called life, sometimes it's highs and lows. And to try to tell the best, to try to basically present the best full picture of the experience of Black soldiers and people that have experienced these historic events, we basically try to tell the full picture as best we can, and that includes incorporating both the positive elements as well as the negative elements. So that way, when people look at this stuff, not only in the future, but even when we connect this to our daily experiences, we understand that hey, like not everything's gonna be a positive experience, but not every negative experience is gonna. Not every negative experience can. Well, sometimes negative experiences can lead to positive experiences and vice versa. So trying to basically have a full picture of the experiences of the people that we talk about.
I think it's so important to be balanced. And also, I agree with you because there are so many entrepreneurs and other people in the workforce who look at pain points to be able to choose what they'll do, what their purpose will be, and where their platform will be. So it's important, I think, to balance between the positive and the negative to make room, right? So thank you for that approach. Here's your next question. Can you give an example of how you've used storytelling to turn a challenging situation into a successful testimonial in your professional or your personal life?
So I would say in the case of professional life, one of those examples will be with the recent exhibition we just did with what's called the Blue Helmets in Action. And so one of the common issues, well, before I even get to that point, when it comes to the narratives of Black military history, most of the narratives tend to focus on specific units and specific personalities, meaning that, like when we talk about Black soldiers in World War II, they tend to focus on Tuskegee Airmen and people like Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who were the commanding officers, or like certain successful pilots. In the case of the recent exhibition with the Blue Helmets, we focus on a lesser known Black unit, which was the 93rd Infantry Division that served in the Pacific Theater of World War II. And one of the stories that we highlighted was a story of a gentleman named Sergeant Daniel Thornton. Now, when you look at his story is interesting and tragic in a way. Like his father was a Black American, his mother was a Mexican American, and he grew up in Arizona like pretty much in the 1920s, 1930s. And right before World War II, he enlisted in the military. And while, like, because of basically his skin color, he ended up in a Black unit. He ended up in the 25th Infantry and served with the 93rd Pacific. He got wounded, and while he survived the war, complications from his war wound ultimately would cause him to pass away less than a year after World War II ended. And so when it came to incorporating his story into the exhibition, we tried to make it the centerpiece for a few reasons. One, when you talk about the story of not only the 93rd, but a lot of these Black units, you're talking about individual narratives that are kind of pieced together to basically kind of form our historic understanding of this unit. And in the case of the 93rd, while there are people like Dr. Robert Jefferson who took time to record the narratives of veterans from the 93rd, very few people really understand kind of just how nuanced a lot of the experience of these soldiers are. And in the case of Daniel Thornton's experience, on the one hand, you talk about a person whose entire military service kind of encompassed the length of the 93rd service in World War II, pretty much being there from the very beginning to being alive when the unit was disbanded. But then also when you talk about what happened to him after and kind of the complications from the war wound, this also led to opening up conversations about not only what the soldiers experienced during the war, but their experiences of themselves and their families after the war. So when you talk about like not only Sergeant Daniel Thornton, but we talk about Black veterans who served in World War II and had to deal with like a lot of these life-changing like situations, either from war wounds that were physical or war wounds that was psychological. And not only that, but in many cases, the denial of resources that would have been provided for their families thanks to their military service, and how that impacts people multiple generations down the road. That serves as kind of a segue to one, not only better understand like units like the 93rd Infantry Division, but also better understand like, well, why why is military history, particularly this military history, important to us today, and more importantly, how it directly impacts us. Because when we talk about military history and history in general, it's like, oh, well, that was in the past. How does that impact us? Well, World War II, yeah, that was 80 years ago, but you and I both know that 80 years ago, that's still someone's lifetime. In some cases, that's literally someone's parent, or in my case, you're talking about like people that were my great grandparents' age. So you're talking about only anywhere between a generation to like two generations removed, but yet we're still feeling those impacts. So, wait, was I even answer the question? I know I kind of went on a lengthy tangent, basically. Was I even answer the
Oh,
question?
you did. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. You did very well. I thank you for that. I also applaud you for bringing up the stories that some of us don't know, or we might not have heard. And I think that's a special skill set for historians. So I applaud you for that. So thank you. All right, here's our next question. What techniques do you use to ensure the stories that you tell resonate with your target audience?
So when it comes to certain techniques we use, we try to look for things that in their experiences that connect to people to today. So like one of the things that I personally have kind of picked up not only from my time in college, but even from my personal experiences that, and as I kind of mentioned before, we tend to preserve narratives of people in military history, or not only military history, but in history in general. We tend to preserve the history of people who stood out, like the MLKs of the world, the MLKs of the world, the Benjamin Davis seniors of the world. But in my personal experience, and not only my personal experience, but people I grew up around and people I've known all my life, most of us, when you start investigating their backgrounds, like yes, it's not to say that these people didn't do amazing things, but when you look at their background, they came from like people who were basically truly middle class back in the 19 teens or the 1920s. Now, a little bit about my family background. We're from a small town called Hopkins, South Carolina, and most of my folks, I would say up until my dad's generation, they the family experience was to basically born, you work the family land, and if you're lucky, you may get a job and kind of break away. But most of it's kind of tied to the family land. And it wasn't until my dad's generation where you start seeing people in earnest kind of going to college. And you're talking about people that was born like in the late 60s, early 70s. And so they were going to college in the late 80s, early 90s. And so I'll bring all this up to say that when it comes to the narratives that we try to basically preserve as not only preserve but we try to highlight people who come from those backgrounds where they may come from a rural town in like Manny, Louisiana. They may come from people that are like salt of the earth or from humble beginnings, and sometimes they're able to like do what people have done. Like some of the people are able to go to college and do pretty well, but then you have those who either make a career out of the military, or sometimes they may go through trials and tribulations and they may succeed. They may still be in the process of trying to succeed. But you try to, when it comes to the highlighting the stories, you try to highlight stories that essentially are of people who, the best way to describe people who are coming up from the earth, basically. Either coming up from the earth or people who are working their way up, or more importantly, people who may not be from the in terms of socioeconomics, they may be from the bottom end of things. And the reason is that while we do have a diverse audience, when you look at most of our audience are like black people. And when you look at where most black folks come from, where do most of us come from? Even though we're a diverse group, most of us come from the deep south. Most of us have ties back to the rural south or just the deep south in general. So normally when I know especially when I try to tell stories, I try to highlight people like that, or like people that either people like that or people who tend not to be highlighted in a lot of the mainline narratives of history.
I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because part of the focus of this channel and this series for our young people at the theater is to let them know how important each of their stories are, and to also understand just how important storytelling is, and how they can transfer skill sets that they learn from the stage to take it anywhere. Um, Also, I'm glad that you brought up about the migration, African American migration in our country, and how, yes, it was so many of us coming from the South to other parts of the country. And when we brought that, we brought our stories with us, we brought our customs with us, and then had to learn how to navigate in different terrains that might have been more urban and such. So thank you for bringing that up as well for the youth to have that knowledge that you just bestowed upon them. So I appreciate that, sir. All right, just a couple more questions to go. And again, I really appreciate your time in doing this with us and for us. Here's the next question. What impact have you seen storytelling have on your audience's engagement and retention of the material?
So, and in this case, it would go back to Sergeant Daniel Thornton. So, as I mentioned before with Sergeant Daniel Thornton, because he's of an interracial background, a lot of people who have seen it, when they tend to think of black units, in particular World War II, or just throughout history in general, they tend to think that, oh, this is just purely black soldiers. When in reality, because of how Jim Crow laws work and because of how systemic racism really worked back then, if you were, it kind of, oh, I'm not getting tongue tied. I apologize about that. But
Oh, you're
best way
fine.
the best way to describe it is like the brown paper bag test. Like if you couldn't pass it, then you were essentially considered black. So as a result, when you talk about these black units in both really from the American Civil War to World War II in Korea, even though you have Black Americans, you also have Afro Latinos in those units. I know in the case of the Civil War, you actually saw Filipinos and Hawaiians who were put in Black units because they were dark skinned. And so as a result, what you would, well, what talking back to what we've seen since we put up the Blue Helmets exhibition was that when you had like Latinos who may come to the museum, they'd be like, well, they may say, "Oh wow, I didn't know that you had Latinos in Black units," and it's like, and so it leads to a conversation where it's like, well, yeah, like this kind of goes back to, well, one, it goes to a conversation of one, kind of how Jim Crow laws work, but then two, how even amongst Latinos, if you were a more white passing Latino, you went to the regular army. But if you were Afro Latino, you went to a black unit. And then that also leads to other conversations about, well, like how do they look in terms of solidarity with certain groups? Because in some cases, when you go to certain areas, because again, like when you talk about the military, you talk about people who serve in the military, and then after they get out the military, they don't really forget their experiences or they have a unique experience and they basically bring it home with them. And so tying it back to the audience engagement, because of stories like that, I know more recently we have been trying to update our our narrative surrounding Native Americans and their interactions with Black soldiers, as well as how Black soldiers interacted with other cultures globally. We have started seeing a more positive response, or a positive response in the sense where people saying, "Oh wow, I didn't," either that they didn't know about that aspect of Black military history, or in the case of some of the returning people, returning visitors, like, "Oh, like we're glad that you're actually starting to incorporate this because like this is a factor that has been there, but when you talk about the historic the narratives of Black military history, while historians would know that they were there, a lot of people would tend to either not really cover the subject, either because they did not know, they didn't have an in-depth knowledge of the subject, or in some cases, let's be frankly honest, it's a very controversial subject too, because there is a lot of things to unpack about it. So because of that, and I'll say also more so kind of a product of the top of the day and age we live in now. So because of that, people are like, oh wow, the fact that you're willing to take the extra step, go and to explore these lesser known subjects and touch on these subjects that, or at least approach head on these subjects that may be deemed controversial and be able to explain, okay, well, this is the reality of it. This is why it's considered controversial, and kind of open it up. It has led to better audience engagement, at least since the year that I've been here, and in the few years that I've been around this museum since I was 14. So
Awesome. Yes, thank you. Yes, it's so important to figure out ways to engage different people in the important stories that we have to share with them. So awesome, awesome response, sir. Next, what ethical considerations should one keep in mind when using storytelling in one's career?
so I would say and again, I'm speaking mostly from my personal experience, so hopefully that can help. But one of the things that I've learned, especially in the year of doing exhibitions here and in my previous years doing exhibitions back home in South Carolina, you provide as much information as you can from all sides so you can get a good picture. And in the case of Black soldiers, in the case of Black military history, one of the things that comes up, and I'll be honest from a personal perspective, like from a personal experience, this can be it can be trying, I'll put it that way. And that's including the narratives of white officers who had negative views about black soldiers. And so, like in most cases, especially in the years when I was coming up doing the research, you would have two camps. You would have the military history camp that would just take purely from the military the officers' records, which were basically like the military records that were published, and they would just publish those, and most of those records, like say for example, with the exhibition we're working on with the 92nd, they would say, oh, well, these black soldiers were cowards and they didn't know how to perform in a fire. And see, we did a whole Army War College study in 1925 stating that these guys don't know how to act. They can't be led by black soldiers. That they only can be led by Southern white officers who better understand. And so you had one camp that would just focus completely on that, and then you had the other camp, which was I would say kind of reactionary in the sense where they say, oh well, we're going to focus primarily on the black soldiers and their experiences, and and of course the good thing about this is that you're highlighting the people that have not been covered, but at the same time, normally when people would cover them, a lot of, shall we say, negative stuff may be left out or negative experiences. And the best way to describe it, I'll probably end up well, take myself. It's almost like the soldier story approach. Like I kind of like when you get a soldier story, like the play in the movie, you end up realizing that the black military experience, yes, you fight racism, but you're also doing a lot of interracial conflict or intraracial conflict as well. And so when one of the dilemmas that we end up facing in this space and is like, well, do we address those intraracial conflicts? Do we talk about them? Because after all, like you're in a space where you're talking about black soldiers in many cases dealing with external racism, and that's bad enough as is, but do we talk about the intra-racial conflicts as well? Because that actually did happen. A lot of that actually did happen, and I found in my experience that we still that it while it can be a touchy subject, you still talk about it because one, when you're able to fully explain, like, hey, like again with the soldier story, I know you probably refers to it by second time in a row. When you look at that whole situation, you're not talking about just the impact of systemic racism on black soldiers, how it's impacting them then, but you're talking about a multi-generational impact and how it impacts people's thinking, their view, not only on the outside world, but how they view others who don't meet their standards. And this is something that again comes up in my research. I've seen this with some historic black figures in the military, and it actually discussing that actually has led to some light conflicts with some other black military historians because it like when you bring up that hey so and so said this and they're like oh he didn't mean that in some way like no like this can be interpreted a certain way because imagine if you're a soldier back then and you hear someone say this because again even though we tend to and that's another thing even though we tend to think of history as distant, one of the things I learned from doing living history and working with one of my mentors, Alan Mack, he made a good point. A lot of these people, we tend to separate them because of the age, but they're still us. They're still us and we're still them. So a lot of stuff a lot of the things that we tend to do and react and say, they would do the same thing. So when you look at it that way, that also kind of adds a whole other layer to it. But to try to summarize what I going into a whole another tangent basically. When it comes down to it, trying to incorporate all elements of a story, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, and presenting it to the people in a way that presenting it in a way that giving the people that are viewing it agency to say, okay, well we know enough to make our own conclusions, and here is the information. Not not giving a partial story and saying, okay, because again, if you give a partial story, that leads to kind of a biased thing. And of course, we as people we do have biases, but when you're in any space, it behooves you to do the best you can to make sure that you remove as much as of your personal bias anything as possible, so that way people can get a full objective view.
Yes. I think I hear you saying make sure that you're exposing audiences to everything you're able to find, and then they can make their own ethical decisions about it as well, about what parts they will use and how to use it. So that's awesome, the way you have an expansive approach to looking at the stories. Thank you for sharing that as well. So here's the last question of the interview, and this is about you. So, lastly, do you have any news that you'd like to share with our audience members?
So, two things in terms, well, I'm saying that I'm connected too much to my work, so this is probably connected to work basically. But one, in November 11th, we're supposed to be releasing our next major exhibition, which is the Buffalo Division in Action, which is going to talk about the 92nd Infantry Division, their experiences in World War One, World War Two, and as I mentioned before, kind of tying their experiences to other situations that was going on at the time, such as their soldiers involved in Red Summer 1919, the political advocacy that was done by people like Ida B. Wells to advocate and protect soldiers, as well as the experience of the soldiers in World War II, how they connect to the Italians, and more importantly, kind of understanding, exploring the nuanced relationships between Black soldiers while they were stationed in Italy and the Italians who they were around. So that's the first major one. That's going to open November 11th. It's going to stay active at least until June, July next year. But the big one is Juneteenth 2025. Juneteenth 2025 is the 160th anniversary. And the reason why we want to make a big deal about this is because we're going to bring in reenactors and living historians who represent the 25th Army Corps, which the 25th Army Corps was one of the few units in the Union Army during the American Civil War that was comprised almost entirely of Black soldiers. So normally when we hear the narrative of Juneteenth, General Granger reads the Emancipation Proclamation and basically tells people you're free. Well, with Juneteenth 2025, we're going to basically provide a more in-depth story about that and try to, shall we say, do some myth busting about some of the aspects of it. And so I would say basically for people put that on your calendar, be on the lookout around Juneteenth 2025. We're gonna have living historians, reenactors. We're gonna have an encampment, and we're also gonna have an exhibition, kind of talking about the role that Black soldiers played not only in the Civil War, but what they did in Texas and how it still impacts things.
Both of those events sound so exciting. So thank you for sharing with our audience that those are coming up. Okay, so those dates are November 11th and then Juneteenth of 2025, correct?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Mr. Carter, again, I'm so honored that you took time to chat with me today for our YouTube channel called Everyone's a Storyteller. While this is not an official YouTube channel for the Ensemble Theater, we are a fan club for the ensemble. The young performers end up sometimes performing on our main stage, but they're throughout the city and in other parts of the country. And we just want them to know that once they come through our theater education program, they can move onto any platform that they wish to because they have these new accomplished skills of storytelling. And so we want to let them know to be encouraged on how to use those skill sets. So thank you again, and the best of luck to you at the Buffalo Soldier Museum. All right. Well, again, I'm Dr. Dane T. Jones. I serve as Director of Fund Development at the Ensemble Theater at 3535 Main, Houston, Texas. And remember, each of us has a story, and every story is worth telling. Until next time, bye.